everyone!
Everybody. So it's time for another What
We Read. That's right. It's piling on.
I know I've been reading a lot lately, so you are going to see a lot of commentary from me today, and I am going to kick things off per usual.
Yes.
So the first book that I have to talk about is my first book from this author. It's Say You Still Love Me by K.A. Tucker, which I got for review from Atria on NetGalley. So Say You Still Love Me is, at its heart, a second chance romance. It kind of flashes back and forth between their past timeline when they were at summer camp together and their present timeline where Paige is like the budding CEO of her father's company and Kyle ends up working as a bodyguard or security guard in the building. Basically, it's exactly what it says on the tin, a second chance romance. And here's the thing, I was really excited because K.A. Tucker has written another book that a lot of my friends love, which I haven't read yet and I'm still gonna give a try. But Say You Still Love Me sort of, just did not live up to the expectations that I had for it. It was funny because at the beginning I was really invested in the past timeline, the summer camp thing, it was really fun. But then that timeline started to get a little less appealing to me, and the other timeline, the present one, was the one that got more appealing to me. I just feel like for me, the build-up wasn't done in a way that really worked for me. It felt at times either too slow or too rushed, and it was never like really well balanced. And I also just didn't fully find myself invested in either Paige or Kyle, and I don't read a lot of romances anymore where the drama is similar to what is in that book, and it ended up just not working for me in the end. Like, it was fine, I didn't hate it either, it was just fine. I'm glad I gave it a shot, but I am looking forward to reading her other book in the hopes that I will like that one more. I'm not very pleased that was my first foray into K.A. Tucker, but I guess we'll see in the future what happens next. And the next book that I'm going to talk about is actually a very highly anticipated YA release for September, and I got this from Penguin Teen. It's Frankly in Love by David Yoon. It centers around a main character named Frank Lee. He's Korean American and he's struggling with what that identity means for him. At the same time, he is also at an age where, you know, he's interested in dating and relationships, and his parents ideally want him to fall in love with someone who is also Korean, but Frank instead ends up falling in love with a white girl. And so in order to sort of circumvent the parental concerns there, he and his family friend, who happens to be Korean, pretend to be dating so that they can date other people. Going into this one of the reasons why it didn't quite live up to the expectations I had for it was because I felt like it sounded more like it was going to be a romantic comedy, and it wasn't. It's actually an exploration into race, into cultural perceptions, into family dynamics, and it's the kind of story where like all the relationships are messy and they don't necessarily make the best choices, and there's a lot of conflict and a lot of difficult things that are being unpacked in this story. I think what I want to say is that there were so many things touched upon, and I feel like it was a lot to take in at once. And I don't necessarily know that I feel like every single thing was tackled in the way that it deserved to be tackled. I didn't also dislike this book, but I didn't love it either. I think it's going to speak to a lot of other people, and I also can't speak to how the Korean culture is represented because I'm not Korean, obviously. It's a good story, and I still found it compelling, and I still read all of it. It just wasn't what I expected. It felt a little overambitious for what it set out to do. And I think, in general, for me, it ended up not being quite my cup of tea, but I can see why it might appeal to someone else. So, if the premise sounds at all intriguing to you, I would go into it just knowing not to frame it as a rom-com, and instead to frame it as a complicated story about this teen boy who is struggling with his own racial and cultural identity, and maybe you'll take away something else that I did not. I also wasn't very fond of Frank as a character, and I think part of that is deliberate because he is portrayed in a way where he's like a messy teen who is making not so great life choices, which I'm sure all of us can relate to on some level. So, but personally for me, he just never really clicked for me as a character, so that's that. And the last book I'm going to talk about before I turn things over to Mackie is a book that I got from Simon & Schuster on NetGalley, and it is a book called Start Here by Trish Dollar. This is a book about two best friends. After their senior year, they were supposed to set sail, and they were going to go on a trip with their other best friend, Finley, who has actually died. So Mila and Taylor are the only two left, and they're still kind of struggling with the decision on whether or not to take this trip. In the end, they decide to go together. And so they're following a list of like clues that Finley has left them, and this entire trip is basically them coming to terms with what's in store for them in the future, and also coming to terms with their grief and sorrow over the loss of their mutual best friend. I really enjoyed the fact that it is a book about sailing and traveling by sailing, because I rarely get to read those, and even though I don't think I would be capable of doing it myself, like for that long term, they were gone for like a month.
Yikes.
On a boat. I'm like, I don't think I could do it. And it was only the two of them crewing the ship too.
Wow.
Which is impressive. And like, I don't think I could do it, but it was really cool
Awesome.
just to see
Yeah,
it happen.
totally.
And I enjoyed like the friendship aspect of it, like how it would sort of tackle what their friendship was like in the past when their other friend Finley was alive, and also what their friendship is like now in the future that they don't have the person who was their glue holding them together. So I thought that was interesting, and I like that it also explored like their thoughts about what their future should look like and what their relationships could be like and stuff like that. I do feel like it was a little too short for what it wanted to be doing. It was good for like what it was, but it could have been even more, I think, emotionally intense if it had been drawn out just a teensy bit longer. I would have liked to see more of what happens in the later part of their journey, really. But overall, I really liked it. Trish Doller's writing is, as always, very readable, very compelling, and the story itself was really fun, so I would highly recommend it, especially if you want to read something that's sort of summary and travel related and friendship related. And now, over to you.
Right, I've had a pretty eclectic reading stint, literally ranging from grimdark all the way to like really high quality middle grade, even younger readers, and I'll get to that in a bit. But I'm going to start with The Last Wish by Andrzej Sapkowski, which is basically the first book in the Witcher series, which is a collection of short stories. First collection, there's a second collection of short stories, and then there's like the Witcher proper, and then all of the other games from there on in. And so I had recently just finished the game this year, so really wanted to get into sort of like the lore, and you know, it's really great. I mean, I unfortunately don't have the, I want to say, mindset to approach the books as, you know, as somebody completely new. Like I can't imagine what it's like to have approached these books from the cold, because Alexa, who is reading this and almost kind of done, at least saw me sort of play through some of the stuff, and so some of the characters are familiar. So these feel more like prequels than they actually are, sort of like in publication order, the release things. For those of you who have not played the game or have never heard this grimdark before, The Witcher is a story set in a medieval kind of dystopian world where there are monsters for whatever reason, and there are a group of people that by trade are called witchers. What they do, they're hired mercenaries to kill specifically demons and monsters and creepy crawlies and everything like that. At the center of it is Geralt, who happens to be exactly one of these witchers. He was mutated like every single one of them. In fact, a lot of witchers don't survive their trial of the grasses, that's what it's called. So little boys are just basically like chemically force-fed with different things, and if they survive, they become witchers, and if they don't, well, you know what, more fodder for the fire. These are this kind of collection of tales where, you know, for witchers who are supposedly chemically modified, shouldn't have any feelings, they've got heightened senses. You have at the center of this story Geralt, who has feelings and has emotions and forms bonds when normal witchers shouldn't be having these bonds. They should just be like sort of killing machines, very 80s action movie type. You know, Steven Seagal kind of, I don't feel anything, but I'll kick everybody's ass, that kind of deal. And so these collection of short stories really sort of build out the Witcher world. The carrot on the stick for Alexa and for most of you out there is that it is also a lovely play on traditional fairy tales, grimdark style. So maybe the beast isn't such a beast. Maybe the beauty is actually a little bit more scary than she actually is. So highly recommended for anybody who wants to try kind of, I want to say this is now mainstream grimdark, right? Because everybody knows about The Witcher now, or at least it's kind of cool. Yeah. So it's mainstreamy. The wonderful world of reading has, you know, like,
it's fascinating.
Has been broadened, and so books like these are sort of now like palatable to most. Cool. Rocketing straight into the middle of the spectrum, Keeper of the Lost Cities, Book 2, Exile. I've made it very clear, I think, in my first review of the first Keeper of the Lost Cities, that I wasn't too fond of the baby YA aspects of this, you know, where there's immediately a ship. And I'm not fond of it, to say the least. This is not my favorite ship of all time, so if this is your ship, then my goodness, you're gonna love this so much if this is your kind of thing. If it's not,
I feel like he's making a pointed comment about me.
It's highly possible that this is totally Alexa's kind of ship, and I want to get that out of the way because there are so many good things about this book that I want to say. And if it's not like myself, for example, not fond of like sort of the main sort of two characters that seem to be quote unquote, well, they're not saying it's destined, but good gracious me, this is the most shippable. Like, everyone's shipping, well, no, the universe is shipping them in this book. Which makes me segue into, if something like this can be so deliberately well thought and well written out, plot wise, conspiracy wise, I'm 100% sure that the ship is probably intentional as well. Especially now that it's
the kind of ship where they think it's a ship.
Well, I hope so. I hope
And
so.
then all of a sudden it's like, ooh, just kidding.
For my personal reading like stakes, I do hope so. But for those of you who've already read like online books, you probably know what's going on here. I'm not going to spoil which ship I don't like, but it's the main one, quote unquote. And guess what? In the second book, a couple of more ships are sort of starting to appear. So it's got that's hence maybe YA. It's like, oh my goodness, it's sort of like a mini harem. But I would like to think this captures for me like what is a Western version of the kind of magical girl trope, where you have an extraordinary girl with extraordinary powers, who just by the sheer strength of her heart is able to, you know, traverse insurmountable odds, right? And I love that. I did. Plus, there's a it's called an alicorn in here. I don't know what that is. And you see it in this. It's not a spoiler. It's literally the first thing you see in the first part of the book, and it is like right there on the cover. So it's not a winged unicorn. It's not a pegacorn. Apparently, it's called an alicorn because it's got more powers and shtick. And I love it. I love the lore. You barely realize that they're elves until you realize they're not eating meat. Very much recommended. I am already on book 3. I cannot wait till I finish the series, and I can't wait for the series to end because I want to see it. I want to get to the ending. The crowning achievement of my reading stint just recently is The Very, Very Far North by Dan Barrell, which is a story for young readers. I want to say middle grade and lower.
Probably.
Seriously, like if they're like 5 years old or 6 years old, they can read. Give them this book because I think it's a great way to sort of get things started. Nice, easy words and nice big font-ish, and illustrations. Why? Because this is the story about Dwayne the polar bear and the friends that he makes in the very, very far, far north. Now, I got super nostalgic. I wrote a review on Goodreads that was actually noticed by the author. And this is a great book that sort of anchors you on this on simple things and how life can actually be wonderful and simple. And one of my favorite quotes from the book is, "Sometimes a day will take you to where you never thought it would," or some such like that. I messed it up. It's on my Goodreads, but I just love it. It's Winnie the Pooh, but I think for a newer generation. And just when I thought I couldn't get any more nostalgic, the last 3 pages of this book pretty much did me in, and I was kind of crying on the way home. So it was just very heartfelt and touching. And it's not the first of its kind, but you form a bond with characters, and I think these characters are very bond-worthy.
Bond-worthy.
I mean, you've got Cece, the snow owl, and Hanson, the musk ox. A bunch of others that we don't want to reveal, but they're there. So cool, that's me.
So I'm going to talk about 3 more books and then we'll wrap this video up.
Yeah.
So the next book I'm going to talk about is a book that I actually reread, and I reread it via audiobook. So the book in question is Unearthed, which is by Amy Kaufman and Megan Spooner. And this one I've talked about before on the channel. It's basically Indiana Jones in space. I enjoyed it. At first I was a little worried because the beginning was a lot slower than I remember it being. But I should probably tell you a little bit what it's about. It's got 2 main characters. There's Jules and there's Amelia, and they both find themselves on this planet that's far from home because of very different reasons. Jules is there to sort of find out the truth about this scientific discovery that his father played a part in, and then Amelia is there because she needs to loot a temple to earn enough money to buy her passage home, and also for her sister, to free her sister from the obligation her sister is under. And so their paths cross in an unlikely circumstance, and they end up teaming up in an effort to get to this temple and to do the things they want to do. But there's way more to the story than that, because obviously this temple was constructed for a reason, and the real question is, why was the temple constructed, and why are all these messages pointing to it? I really enjoyed the audio. I think it really was an effective way of listening to it. I find that I like listening to science fiction a lot more than I like reading it, which is a new discovery for me, but not an unwelcome one. I had a hard time with the beginning because it is a little bit slow. It takes a while for the build-up to really happen, where you kind of get to know Amelia, you also kind of get to know Jules, and then you also get to see them sort of interact together and get to know each other, and it's kind of slow. It gets real interesting once they team up and they are headed to the temple. Once that part starts, everything is just like quick and fast and exciting, and it's like sort of like watching The Mummy, but in book form, in space, which makes it really fun. And I did recall most of it, but it was just fun to revisit it and to hear it in a whole different light because I was listening to the audio. And the reason that I reread that is because I'm planning to read the next book this month, hopefully.
Oh, hey!
So I can finally finish that series. It was very enjoyable. I still would recommend checking it out. I don't know that it is one of those books where I would constantly want to reread it, but if you are looking for something that's a fun sci-fi sort of adventure, then that's a good one, and I would totally recommend it. The next book I'm going to talk about, I finished literally on the very last day of July because I refuse to lose at this whole, like, my friends recommend books to me and I read them every month. The book in question is A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. I finally read this book, and I really enjoyed it. It is not a full-on like 5-star new favorite for me, but it was definitely a lot of fun. So A Darker Shade of Magic is set in a world where there are 4 different Londons. There is Black London, which basically no one talks about. There is Red London, where magic exists. There's White London, where magic also exists. And then there is Grey London, where people don't really know about magic. And there is only one person, technically, who can travel between these 4 Londons, and his name is Kel. He serves as an ambassador, but he also likes to smuggle artifacts from one London to another. One day, something that he smuggles gets stolen, and so he has to go on this like rip-roaring chase to get it back, because it has an effect that is rippling throughout all of the Londons.
Cool.
So it's a really good story. It's a really great setup, really great lore. I quite enjoyed the characters. I think Kel and Lila and Holland and everyone, really, they're great, and it's fascinating. And I like that it is cut into different parts and that you follow different characters within the story, because that's always interesting to me. I actually love stories with ensemble casts, especially if the casts feel like they're all very different and unique characters and they're fun to follow in that sense.
Hey.
The one thing I will say is there's just something about the way this one is written, in much in the way that I reacted to Mistborn. It's also the same thing where I don't quite feel fully invested. Like, I can see the merits of every single part of the story. I like the characters, I like the story, but there's just something about the writing that is making it impossible for me to fully connect. I don't know if that will change with the next 2 books, because in this one they actually wrap up the story pretty well, and it's like a good story all on its own. But as of right now, like, the only reason that I didn't like fully love this one is just because I didn't fully get into the writing style. And it's not because it was not a good writing style, it's just not my usual cup of tea, I guess. But I still enjoyed it. I am still glad I read it. I am definitely continuing the series because I am curious to see what else happens after the events of this one. And there's still a lot of unresolved plot lines here, so we're gonna have to wait and see. But I'm glad I finally read this. And I know Maki wants to read it too. So the last book I'm going to talk about is one that I read for Friends with Arcs with my friend Rachel from Hello Chelly. That's a feature we've been doing for like 5 years now, where we both read arcs together and then answer a question that has to do with the arc. Start Here was actually also a Friends with Arcs read. But this one is She's the Worst. It's by Lauren Spieler, and we got this one off NetGalley thanks to Simon Dean. She's the Worst is actually a story that takes place over the course of one day. It's about 2 sisters, an older one who is going away to college, and a younger one who's getting left behind, and the younger one decides to plan this day out full of like special places to the 2 of them. The entire story is actually about how complicated their sister relationship is, and how sometimes you might see one thing, but that's actually not what the other person's intention was, and vice versa. As someone who has 2 sisters of my own, I found that really interesting because it's true, and I've experienced it for myself, and I liked seeing that dynamic play out in the book. It was really interesting because they both had very different perspectives on their relationship and their parents and their school and their friend. Like, it was interesting to get both of their perspectives in this one, and I also like the fact that they sort of like go all around Los Angeles and do all these things that are meaningful to them, but for different reasons. I do feel like it's one of those stories where like you feel like you're only getting a part of the bigger story, because it really only takes place in one day, and you really can't resolve every single issue that you've got in the span of just one day. But I do think that it chronicles the sister relationship so well that I was able to overlook that, and I ended up really enjoying it. So if you're interested, if you like books about sisters especially, then I think you should check it out.
Great.
And those are all the books we're going to talk about
right.
in this particular What We Read. We hope you enjoyed it. If you've read any of these books, or if you're excited about any of these books, if you want us to read more of these books, because we have a lot of series that we mentioned clearly, let us know. We would love to hear your thoughts. And we will see you guys with another video soon. Bye!